Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to create a cantus firmus. Now, normally when you take a counterpoint course, you don't learn how to create the cantus firmus. The instructor will provide you with a cantus firmus that then you have to create a counterpoint solution to. What I'm going to do is just a little bit different. I want to teach you how to actually create your own cantus firmus. You can think of it as a melody, and I may use that term while I'm talking about the cantus firmus, but in reality, the cantus firmus is sort of a skeleton for an eventual melody. A cantus firmus is going to be very basic. Rhythmically, it's limited, so there's not a lot going on. You'll notice that all the cantus firmi that we actually use in the examples today, they're just going to be whole notes, and that's sort of the traditional way of teaching counterpoint. So we are going to start with the basics in melodic construction, because when you go and try and write first species counterpoint solutions, you are essentially creating a cantus firmus on top of the original cantus firmus. Now, of course, we don't call it a cantus firmus, we call it a counterpoint, but you're essentially having to create melodies, so I think it makes sense to start with the melodic content. So let's just talk a little bit about counterpoint. Counterpoint is when you have a combination of two or more simultaneous and independent melodies that work together to create harmony. Now, harmony isn't necessarily the goal. When you write counterpoint, you're thinking only about the horizontal aspect of music, the melodic aspect, and not the harmonic aspect. If you get into 18th century counterpoint, then harmony comes into play more. But since we are going to deal primarily with 16th century Quasi-Palestrina style, then we're not going to worry about harmony at this point. We are just going to create multiple lines that work together simply because of the nature of the intervals that you use between those two parts. So what ends up happening is you get two melodies that actually work pretty effectively with each other. So one term is the cantus firmus. So this translates to fixed voice. It's a Latin term, and this is a part of the counterpoint that the teacher normally provides. It's fixed. You are not allowed to change it. In this particular lecture, I encourage you to try and create your own cantus firmi, so you can practice creating these melodies before you try and write a first species counterpoint. So the counterpoint solution, this is a solution that the student creates above or below the cantus firmus. So this is a part that the student actually has to work out on their own. Let's talk a little bit about the types of counterpoint. There's modal counterpoint, uses the church Gregorian modes, such as Aeolian, which usually in our context is going to be the mode that starts on C. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Sounds like a major scale. Your next one is going to be D, Dorian. So it uses all the notes of a C major scale, but it starts on the note D. So you don't have that B flat for D minor, you don't have the F sharp or the C sharp for D major. So that gives it its own unique tone, and you should actually write these out and listen to them and memorize the sounds of these modes as well. So Phrygian starts on the third scale degree, which would be E, and again it uses the notes of the C major scale. Lydian starts on the fourth scale degree. Mixolydian comes next. It starts on the fifth scale degree. And then Aeolian starts on the sixth scale degree, and that correlates to our natural minor scale. The mode that starts on B, which is Locrian, was actually never used because you have that first scale degree, which is a B. Then you have a fifth scale degree, which is an F. If you build a triad on that tonic, you've got B, D, and F, which is diminished. So it makes it very hard to establish resolution, because the fifth scale degree, which so often serves as a dominant in a composition, and it helps us get our bearings in a lot of ways, you can't change it into a perfect fifth. It's going to be a tritone between the B and the F. So because of that, Locrian was too problematic, and it was actually never used in 16th century counterpoint. There's also tonal counterpoint. So essentially the rules for tonal and modal counterpoint are the same. The only difference is with tonal counterpoint, you're just going to use the major and minor scales. And then we have 20th century counterpoint. This is people like Schoenberg, Sessions, Stravinsky, and other composers. They pioneered the concept of 20th century counterpoint. And that is where you start to use more dissonance than consonance, so you kind of change the rules of counterpoint. And there's many different attempts at 20th century counterpoint, so it'd be difficult to say it's a style that resembles this, because so many different composers and theorists have created their own interpretation of what they think 20th century counterpoint should be. So species counterpoint. In the 17th and 18th centuries approximately, we started to create a strict set of rules for learning counterpoint, and these rules became known as species counterpoint. So Fuchs wrote Gradus ad Parnassum as a tutorial. It was meant to be educational, a pedagogical approach to teaching species counterpoint of the 16th century. It was intended to promote the style of Palestrina. This is a very good book to read. It's sort of considered, and was for a long time, it was the reference for all tonal music. I'll hold that up there for a minute. You can find this all over the place. It's on Amazon, and I think you can even find it on imslp.org, although you may get a more historical version that's a little bit harder to read. If you speak Latin, I think you can find the original Latin version. So it's a good book to have as an extra resource. So the book begins with 2 voice sets and then moves to counterpoint in 3 and 4 voices. As far as I'm concerned, I only care to get to 3-part counterpoint. At that point, you can pick up Fuchs or any other counterpoint text and you can learn 4-part counterpoint on your own, because you'll have the basic understanding under your belt. The 18th century style begins to focus more on harmony, as I've sort of alluded to earlier, and it deals more closely with the music of Bach. So you've basically got your Palestrina style, your Bach style, and then maybe your Schoenberg or your Berg style and other modern composers. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and other composers, they all studied the Fuchs textbook. Just keep in mind it's not pure 16th century counterpoint. So because he did live in the 17th century and there were sort of inclinations toward 18th century harmony, he doesn't write a pure treatise on 16th century counterpoint. It mixes the styles just a little bit. So there are some things that are not pure 16th century style, but I am less concerned with this, because the goal of counterpoint is to teach composers and musicians to start recognizing patterns in music and to start thinking about music in terms of its horizontal relationship as opposed to just chords on a screen. So often we think about harmony in terms of triads and 7th chords, and we think that this is how we compose. But counterpoint is an entirely different way of thinking about the music you see in front of you, where you're less concerned about what chords a composer is using and more concerned about something known as voice leading. So essentially all of counterpoint is voice leading. We're going to teach you the various voice leading principles that allow for balanced melodies. Doesn't mean these principles should be used to compose music, especially modern music, but it's very helpful to learn the music of the past and understand why they had certain voice leading principles before you move on to something a little bit more extravagant. I always, that old saying, you need to learn the rules before you can break them. I think that applies. So the types of species counterpoint you'll be learning as we go. I'm not going to illustrate these right now, but I will later. First species is where you essentially have a whole note against another whole note. So it's going to move in strict time with each other, and basically you'll have one whole note per measure. Second species, the counterpoint solution will have half notes in it, and the cantus firmus will still use whole notes. So you notice that's the same for all the species. All of these, except for fifth species, are different note values against whole notes. So the whole note will always be the cantus firmus. So in third species, you get quarter notes against whole notes. And then in fourth species, you get syncopated half notes. So it's a species of suspensions against whole notes. And that's actually kind of a fun one, because once you learn fourth species, you can move on to fifth species, where you combine all four species to create something closer to real composition. So this course is rooted in the principles outlined by Fuchs, but we make accommodations to account for modern compositional techniques as well. So I will teach you 16th century style, or close to it, but then I will also try and apply it to more modern works and give you a broader overview of counterpoint as opposed to just 16th century. This course is practical and not stylistic in nature. I'm not concerned with the academic arguments about counterpoint. I understand them, but I think that the goal of counterpoint, if you're going to learn it, is to learn to compose. So if you take counterpoint from 4 different instructors, I always say this, you're going to get 4 different ways of teaching it and 4 different interpretations of the rules. So rather than getting into arguments over, well, Fuchs says you can only have an ascending minor 6, and that is the only 6 allowed. But then you go to the Salzer book and Karl Schachter, you find that they don't mention anything about the minor 6th leap. And then you go to Jeppesen, and maybe there will be another argument against or for particular voicing that can be used. So we're not getting into the nitpicky stuff. We're more interested in, can you create a counterpoint solution and a cantus firmus that sound melodic and create the goal of a forward moving line that has a goal and an end? And can you get there fluidly? That's what I'm concerned about with counterpoint. So we've got 3 basic rules here, or goals that we're going to try and reach. We're going to expand the concepts employed by Fuchs to a more varied and diverse musical repertoire. We want to adopt new teaching materials that are useful to 20th century musicians. So I'm taking a conventional approach to counterpoint, but I'm also providing extra information as I feel that it's applicable. And I want to place an emphasis on writing and not analyzing contrapuntal works. Now, analyzing contrapuntal works is how you learn. It's how you see how they did it and how you see how you can improve upon something that's already been mastered, right? So it's important to analyze the works, but it's even more important to put in the practical application. And with any counterpoint melody, any cantus firmus you write, any counterpoint, you should always also try and hear it mentally and sing it. So when you hear it mentally, if you have 2 lines, you should try and hear both lines at the same time. If you have 3, you should try and hear 3. If you have 4, you should try and hear 4. If you don't engage the inner ear and your sight singing abilities, then you're missing a major part of counterpoint, in my opinion. Because for me, counterpoint really helps you to develop a really strong internal musical environment where you can listen to music, where you can write music, you can compose, you can internalize it. That is really the main goal of counterpoint for me. If you learn the rules, great, but this is really a technique for learning to think like a composer and to think musically. So you can just pick up a score and maybe you have to play each line individually, but then you can put them all together and you can hear that score in your head. And the more you do this, the more you just pick up a score and internalize it, the easier it becomes. So this is sort of one of the goals, is to develop that inner ear. So the rules of counterpoint. They're really guidelines. So the rules of counterpoint are the most commonly applied principles uncovered from the most famous composers of modal and tonal counterpoint. With art, we're always going to have exceptions. So just know that there's going to be exceptions to every principle that I talk about. So you want to learn the rules to establish a baseline to evaluate and create future works, or to better understand what makes one composer different from another. If Beethoven follows the rules of counterpoint to a T, and then, Gluck comes along and he's actually an earlier composer, doesn't quite follow those rules, then we can see what makes Gluck and Beethoven different, at least from a contrapuntal standpoint. So it's a useful tool for comparing as well. Musicians who want to compose music should have a good mix of rule-based work in creative experimentation. I firmly believe that. If you want to be an effective composer, you've got to have that intuitive, innate ability, which can be developed, and you need to have that creative experimentation where you just go out on your own, and if it sounds good, you listen to it and you try and figure out why it sounds good to you. But you also, I believe, should learn from the music of the past using these sort of formulaic, almost dogma associated principles like we have in Counterpoint. And the reason the rules help is because if you're a composer or a musician and you can learn to follow these rules musically, it makes your musical brain just a little bit more powerful. It's not necessarily that you're going to write in these styles, but it does teach you and it trains your brain to be much more effective at composing and interpreting music. So it's very important to have a fine mix between the theory and your own experimentation, especially if you're a composer. So, contour. Very important part of melody. Up until the 20th century, most musical lines had a natural rise and fall in the melody that resulted in musical contour. So typically you'd have a single high point and then the melody would come back down to the original starting point. A lot of the music would be stepwise, and we'd have very few skips or leaps because stepwise motion is easier to sing. It's easier to follow in a lot of ways. And it also provides really strong voice sitting that pushes the music forward. Anytime you have a leap, you are disrupting the flow of the line. And once you have a leap, we need to have that resolution that goes in the opposite direction. Otherwise, we're missing something. So here, I'm going to show you melodic motion. So your conjunct motion would be moving by step. So here we have the first line. You can see it right here. You just have your C going up to a G, back down to C, but it's all stepwise. Bum 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 bum. It's very simple. I actually can't see this because my face is in the way and I'll have to move it. But here we have this perfect fifth. Bum bum. And then it goes down a third, up a fifth, down a third, up a minor sixth. So here's that ascending minor sixth. So you'll see that this line is what we would consider to be disjunct. This line is conjunct. Those are two rules that are actually, or two terms that are important in counterpoint. Ideally, we want to have more conjunct motion, so stepwise motion, than disjunct motion. This is a lot harder to sing. This is no problem. This is just up and down that major scale. So for this example, I don't want to play this for you. I want you to pause the recording and I want you to attempt to sing this and attempt to sing this one and see which one is easier to sing. This will also help you develop your ear. I'm sure all of you should say that the stepwise motion is easier to sing. If you say the disjunct motion is easier to sing, then I think you're probably just messing with me or you're very different, which is totally fine. So take a second, pause it, come back, play it on the piano, make sure you got the right pitches, and then we can move on. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide, so make sure you pause it if you need to. Alright, so leaping in a melody. Consonant leaps. So we can use stable intervals. When we talk about the sixth, this is a more, I think, honest way of talking about it. The ascending minor sixth is going to be the most common sixth. Some theorists will say, including Fuchs, the only sixth that you can have is an ascending minor sixth. But it's more honest to say that it's just the most common sixth. The ascending major sixth is going to be less common, and Fuchs does tell you to avoid it altogether. Descending sixths are going to be really rare, with the major sixth being the least common. Try and sing a minor sixth. It's easier to sing ascending than descending. Try and sing a major sixth. If you sing a minor sixth, then you have this tendency for the note to want to resolve down. So it's kind of an important concept. So here's a minor 6. I'm going to play it for you on a digital keyboard. It sounds like it wants to come down. Bum, bum, bum. The major 6, I don't know where it wants to go. It feels a little bit unstable, but it could go up or down. It doesn't really have a strong tendency, in my opinion. So the minor 6 has this really strong pull to come down. If you play a descending minor 6, it doesn't have that pull to come back up. It's just a completely different sound. So it makes sense that the ascending minor 6 would be used more commonly, because that dissonance, that ever so slight dissonance, it's still a consonant interval, but it creates just a little bit of a need to resolve. It wants to come back down by step, so it makes sense that they'd use the minor 6. If you have leaps, you want to resolve them in the opposite direction by step. The 6 could resolve up or down, but it's typically going to be resolved downward by step. So dissonant leaps, these are going to be your seconds, your sevenths, and your tritone. So dissonant leaps are unstable. They were never used melodically in the 16th and 18th century, but in modern counterpoint, it's used all the time. In fact, dissonance becomes the predominant factor in modern music. You want to resolve diminished intervals, so that's your diminished fifth, most typically. You want to resolve that inward to a third. An augmented interval, like an augmented fourth, would resolve outward by step, but this only applies when you start to get into second species or later. It doesn't apply to first species, because in first species, which you'll learn, we're only going to use consonant intervals. So you also want to resolve any sevenths downward by step. So your consonant leaps. Your consonants are going to be your thirds and your sixes. We call those imperfect. I'll talk about this more in the next lecture. And then you also have your perfect fifth and your perfect fourth melodically, and your perfect octave. So the perfect intervals and then your major and minor thirds and sixes are considered consonant. Everything else is dissonant. Compound intervals should typically be avoided. So if you did have a compound interval, the absolute largest one you could have is a tenth, but you're going to find that that does not occur in counterpoint. Typically the largest leap you have is going to be an octave, and even that's kind of rare. More commonly, it's going to be an interval of a fifth or a sixth. So you want to keep your leaps singable, is really what it comes down to. Remember, we're writing for voice right now. We're not really writing for instruments, we're writing for voice. And so we want to make it as singable as possible. So here's an example. You've got these consecutive skips and leaps that expand the melody beyond an octave. So here we have a fifth, followed by a third, followed by a fourth. So this extends the melody beyond an octave, because we start in a C. We wouldn't really want to go above a C here, but we go all the way up to the E. This would be something that would be very hard to sing, and it would be something that you'd want to avoid. So again, you should pause this and try and sing this. You should also avoid consecutive fourths and fifths, which are uncommon in tonal counterpoint. So here, I've got a fifth followed by another fifth. That would be really hard to sing, and again, it kind of goes back to the first rule, because it expands the melody beyond an octave. So it takes it up to the D instead of the C. Here you have a fourth followed by another fourth. So this is something else you would want to avoid. Essentially, if you have a skip or a leap, whenever possible, you should just resolve it in the opposite direction by step if possible. So let's look at a few more examples. Steps, skips, and leaps melodically. You should resolve a leap with a step in the opposite direction, but skips or leaps that are smaller than the initial leap are often used as well. So here we have an octave. It comes down by step. That's sort of the perfect resolution, and if you can do it, you should. Here, you have an octave, and then it resolves down a third. This is also okay. It's not going to give us that nice stepwise voice leading. as the first example, but at least it does move in the other direction. So there's this concept that if you have a skip or a leap, you should resolve it in the opposite direction by step, or to at least fill in the tones you skipped over at least partially. So if I jump down to a G, it'd be okay. An F would be okay. An E would be okay. A D would not, because then that would be a dissonant interval. So you always got to watch your dissonant melodic leaps. Skips, which consists of a third, so we have a skip here. It can be resolved by step in the same or opposite direction. However, you should avoid consecutive skips unless you form a triad. So let's look at this. So here we have a skip. It goes up by step. That's actually okay, but it'd still be better if you came down to the D here. Here, you have multiple skips. It outlines a triad, so this seemed to be more acceptable. Notice it's a major triad. You don't want to outline a diminished triad. Here, this would be a problem because we skip up to the A and then we come back down to the F. So I call this sort of a rocking motion. It really stands out and it disrupts the continuity of the line. So avoid something like this. Here, we want to avoid stepwise motion that is then followed by a leap in the same direction. So if we look at this, we've got this C going to a D, to an E, and F, all stepwise. And then it all of a sudden leaps up to the C. A better option would be C to D, a leap up to a G, which then comes down to the F, and then jumps up to the C. So this downward and then leaping motion is actually better than just moving in a straight line and then leaping. You want to kind of avoid that. It's just awkward. You also want to establish a tonality. So you can establish a tonality in a few ways. You can emphasize the fundamental tones of the phrase model. So the scale degree 1, the 4, and the 5. In general, if we're creating a good melody, which we're not really doing with the Cantus firmus, it's sort of a skeleton for the melody. The melody should have the goal of the dominant in the second to last measure, followed by the tonic. Now, the way that counterpoint works is you tend to have a dominant, but it's usually an inversion. And it'll be a contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence, but you don't need to worry about that. You just need to worry about starting and ending your Cantus firmus in the correct way. To create stress in the melody, and stress helps move the piece forward, it's useful to emphasize the tonic at the beginning and the end of the piece. So what this does is it helps to firmly establish the mode or the key. Use other scale degrees to create tension, so moving to that second scale degree and then moving into the third, that creates tension with the original tonic, and it creates a desire to resolve through the dominant to the tonic at the end of the piece. You want to avoid unresolved leading tones and tendency tones. So I told you if you have a seventh, resolve it down if possible. Your tendency tones, another one is the leading tone. That's a 7th scale degree and it likes to resolve up. This is just a general rule, but you don't have to follow it strictly. It's just better when you can. So if you're using a minor scale and you're not writing a modal piece, then you want to use the raised form of the scale when ascending and use the natural form when descending. So if you were in D minor, you have your B flat, possibly a B natural, and then a C sharp on the way up. And then on the way down, you could have a C natural, could have a B, but more likely a B flat on the way down because we want to use that natural form when descending. The range of the counterpoint. Your melody should not exceed the range of a tenth. So if I have an E, and then I go up a tenth to an E, so C, at the bottom of the staff, right below the treble clef, middle C, and I jump all the way up to an E on the top space of the treble clef staff, that's going to be a tenth, and that's going to be really hard for anybody to sing, so you want to avoid that. You want to carefully treat, hide, and de-emphasize dissonance so that they are not exposed on main beats. So that's really important for creating a Cantus firmus, because that means you should really not have any dissonances when you create a second line. So this is something that's really going to apply more to second species and later, because in first species you should have no dissonance, and when creating a simple cantus firmus you don't have the context of the counterpoint yet to know if there's going to be a dissonance. You should also avoid using any intervals that are greater than an octave. So just try and avoid any intervals greater than an octave, but again, this also sort of applies to first species. You want to avoid chromatic relationships in your melody that aren't native to the key or mode. So if you are in Aeolian, which starts on C, you've got C, D, E, and F. E and F are a minor second, and that's okay. What would not be okay is if you had a B flat going to a B natural. That's a chromatic relationship you want to avoid. If you do, let's say you're in Lydian, or maybe Dorian, and you want to use that B flat, you can use the B flat and then go back to B natural, but you should put at least one measure, preferably two, between any occurrence of the B flat and the B natural. This helps let the ear forget, and then we don't feel like it's so chromatic. So the final thing we're going to do is look at some of these solutions, and you should try and sing all of these. All these examples are from Fuchs. So notice here we have a skip of a third that resolves up by step. Again, better if it moved down to D, but this is permissible because skips can either resolve up or down, but they should resolve by step when possible. So here we have a skip down to an E. So this is disjunct. And then what Fuchs does is he actually leaps up to A. So after this skip, he doesn't resolve it in the opposite direction by step. Instead, he actually leaps up to the A, which is a high point. So in this particular instance, this is good because the high point is now being emphasized. We're going to really hear it because of the skip followed by the leap. It would still probably be better if this G came down to an F and then skipped up to an A. But there's nothing technically wrong with this either, because skips, remember, they don't really have to resolve. It's nice when they do, but they don't have to. So here we come down by step, another skip, resolves up by step, and then stepwise motion to the end. One of the things you'll notice is in all of these counterpoints, the last three bars are stepwise, and the last two descend by step into what we call the final, if it's a mode, or the tonic if it's major or minor. So we have D coming down to C, scale degree 2 to 1, scale degree 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. All of these have scale degree 2 going to 1. So that's really important. So here we have a skip, comes down by step, down again by step, a leap, resolved in the opposite direction, a consonant high point. Notice all the high points are consonant. You don't want a dissonant high point. And then it just comes down by step. So these two, both of them, use primarily conjunct motion, so all stepwise, and they have a single high point. That's really important. So this one, we skip down, resolve up, resolve down by step, then we have a skip and a leap. And notice, before this leap, we move into it from the other direction. So the C goes down and then it goes up. Look at this leap here. This G goes down and then it goes up. Notice there aren't many leaps except for this one here where it's approached in the same direction and then it leaps into it. So that's something you do want to avoid. But this is a good solution because we have this high point and then it comes back down to the tonic. So here we've got another one. We've got multiple skips, but notice it outlines a minor triad. You've got A, F, and D. And then we move up. Here we have a leap. It's resolved using a smaller interval than the leap. And then we have another triad being outlined, and it resolves by step. So here you have a leap that goes in the opposite direction for its resolution. Skips down, leaps up again. This is not an ideal resolution. Fuchs actually uses this as an example. But here we have the notes C, E, and G. So it's outlined in the triad. That makes this just a little bit more acceptable. If it was G to C to F, that wouldn't work. But because this triad is consonant and it is major, he can kind of get away with this leap followed by a skip, and then it finally resolves here with the D. So notice again we have another skip here, or another leap from the D to the G. This E comes down in preparation for the leap. Same thing here. This B comes down in preparation for the leap. And then we outline another triad, move by step. Here we just have an interval of a third, and it continues down. So you should learn to sing all of these, and you should learn to hear them mentally before you go on to the next part of this series. So I will be really impressed if you can kind of go through, memorize all these, and then kind of play around with your own creation of your own cantus firmi, because that's really the point. So you want to make them fluid, you want to have a single high point. Low point is actually a little bit less important. You'll notice, let's see, here we have more than one low point. Here we only have one low point. Here we have one low point. Low points repeated. So the low point is not as important as a high point, but you'll notice for every single one of these there's a single high point. The high point's never duplicated. So you do want to watch for that high point. And just notice how majority of the motion is stepwise, and we're avoiding any patterns. Like here, this E, F, G, you don't see that again. Here, this F, E, D, this is similar because you've got an F, E, D, but it's expanded by this other stepwise motion, so it eliminates the sound of that pattern. So you really want to avoid patterns, and you want to have that high point. And let me know if you have any questions.